hygiene, poverty, and crime.
The wind whipping through European ports between 1500 and 1700 carried more than just the briny tang of the sea. It was a complex symphony of scents, a potent cocktail of human endeavor and desperate survival. Imagine the rich aroma of spices from distant lands, mingling with the metallic glint of freshly minted silver, the earthy scent of timber, the cloying sweetness of sugar, and the pungent, exotic whiff of tobacco. These were the intoxicating fragrances of a world rapidly expanding, of imperial glory stretching its tendrils across oceans. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity, an undercurrent of something far less appealing permeated the air. The stench of filth, the cold dread of disease, and the gnawing pangs of hunger. This era, often celebrated for its grand voyages and monumental discoveries, held a brutal truth within its bustling port cities, a stark contrast between the wealth amassed and the raw struggle for existence faced by countless souls. Before we delve deeper into these hidden aspects of European maritime expansion, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. These ports, Lisbon, Seville, Amsterdam, London, were not merely dots on a map. They were the throbbing heartbeats of empires, the vital arteries connecting continents. Here, the sheer volume of goods was unprecedented, a constant dizzying dance of ships arriving and departing. Day in and day out, mountains of cargo were unloaded, tons of raw materials and finished products heaving from ship holds onto docks by the sweat and toil of laborers. Yet, while trade soared to unimaginable heights, the fundamental sanitation infrastructure of these burgeoning cities utterly failed to keep pace. Picture streets that were not paved but often flooded with waste, open sewers meandering through crowded thoroughfares, and contaminated water sources shared by thousands. Global commerce, the engine of a new world order, thrived amidst an urban precarity that would shock modern sensibilities. The very ground beneath their feet was a testament to both astonishing progress and profound neglect. The lives of sailors, the very backbone of this maritime expansion, offer a particularly grim insight into the era's hygiene. Weeks, sometimes months, at sea meant baths were a rare luxury, fresh water rationed with extreme prejudice, and diseases a constant lurking threat on board. Scurvy, dysentery, and fevers were not just risks, but almost certainties. Upon arrival in port, these weary mariners, often riddled with ailments, immediately plunged into crowded taverns and makeshift dormitories. The close quarters, the lack of proper sanitation, and the sheer density of bodies created perfect breeding grounds for fleas, lice, and a myriad of infections that circulated silently, invisibly, from person to person. Ports, therefore, became more than just economic hubs. They were epicenters for transmitting not only goods and cultures, but also the relentless spread of human suffering and disease. The invisible enemies were just as potent as any storm at sea, shaping the fate of individuals and entire populations alike. As the grand ships docked and discharged their precious cargo, gold and silver flowed into the royal coffers, enriching monarchs and merchants alike. Yet this burgeoning wealth, the very lifeblood of empires, rarely trickled down to those who toiled closest to its source. The port districts, teeming with activity, were also epicenters of profound poverty. Laborers, loaders, stevedores and artisans, the unsung heroes of this global trade, lived on wages that were as unstable as the sea itself. A delayed ship, a sudden storm, or a shift in market demand could mean immediate hunger for entire families. Their existence was a precarious tightrope walk between sporadic employment and utter destitution. These communities grew dense, improvised, and tragically vulnerable. Small houses, often no more than single rooms, were packed together, sharing walls and often air. Overcrowding was not an exception but the norm, with multiple generations or even multiple families sharing cramped quarters. Ventilation was poor, if it existed at all, turning these dwellings into suffocating traps where the air hung heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale food and dampness. The stark inequality was a palpable presence, a constant reminder that while maritime trade built fortunes for some, it built only fragile, transient shelters for many others. The glittering promise of global commerce cast a long, dark shadow of urban precarity, an inescapable consequence of an economic system that valued profit above human dignity. This intense concentration of wealth, alongside such desperate instability, inevitably fostered a fertile ground for crime. The docks, brimming with valuable cargo, were a constant temptation. Cargo theft was rampant, with goods vanishing into the labyrinthine alleys of the port cities as quickly as they were unloaded. Smuggling, too, was an art form perfected by necessity, with illicit goods bypassing customs officials and flowing into clandestine markets. Beyond grand schemes, everyday life was punctuated by tavern brawls, fueled by cheap alcohol and the frustrations of a brutal existence. Authorities, often thinly spread and overwhelmed by the constant flux of people, found their control limited. The sheer anonymity offered by the bustling port environment, with its endless stream of new faces and transient populations, became a shield for illegal networks to flourish. Crime in these bustling hubs was not always born of pure ambition or malice. Often it was a direct consequence of survival. A hungry family could drive a man to snatch food from a market stall, or a desperate woman to pick a pocket. The lines between right and wrong blurred in the face of starvation, transforming petty theft into a grim act of defiance against an indifferent system. The port cities, therefore, became a crucible where the forces of economic expansion and human desperation clashed, creating a volatile, often violent social landscape. And then there was the omnipresent threat of disease, a silent, insidious enemy carried by the very ships that brought prosperity. Epidemics, often with devastating speed and ferocity, entered through the ports, swiftly transforming bustling thoroughfares into ghostly quiet streets. Authorities, grappling with a profound lack of scientific understanding, resorted to improvised quarantines. Ships arriving from infected regions might be forced to anchor offshore for weeks, their crews isolated and left to the mercy of their ailments. Entire neighborhoods, particularly those densely populated port districts, could be temporarily sealed off, trapping residents within a grim, often fatal embrace of contagion. These measures, though well-intentioned, were often partial and ineffective. The unseen pathogens, carried by rats, fleas, or simply the breath of an infected person, defied the rudimentary barriers. Port cities lived in a state of constant alert, a collective anxiety simmering beneath the surface of daily life, knowing that any incoming vessel could herald the next wave of plague or fever. The very gateways to the world were also its most vulnerable entry points for death, making life in these vibrant, chaotic centers a continuous dance with fear. The European ports of 1500 to 1700 were more than just bustling hubs of commerce. They were truly agents of global change, forging the very networks that would soon bind continents together. They were the crucibles where empires expanded, fortunes were made, and the global economy, as we understand it, began to take shape. This monumental progress, however, was not built on a foundation of pristine order or enlightened urban planning. Instead, it rested precariously on the shoulders of poor hygiene, stark social inequality, and pervasive urban violence. The narrative of maritime progress, often romanticized as a clean, orderly march of discovery, was in reality an intense, chaotic, and often brutal affair. The wealth generated by exotic goods and new trade routes flowed through cities struggling with the most basic human needs, a paradox that defined the era. This period saw a dramatic reshaping of human civilization, driven by the ceaseless activity of these port cities. From Lisbon's docks, spices and gold flowed in, transforming the city and the nation. Seville became the gateway to the New World, its streets awash with silver, yet its back alleys teemed with the desperate. Amsterdam, a marvel of engineering and trade, wrestled with the waste generated by its burgeoning population. London, the sprawling capital, struggled to contain its filth, even as its ships sailed to every corner of the globe. Each port, a microcosm of the larger imperial ambitions, reflected the inherent tensions between grand visions and gritty realities. The constant movement of people and goods, while propelling nations forward, simultaneously created pockets of immense destitution and hotbeds of disease and crime, a stark counterpoint to the official narratives of glory and conquest. When we typically envision the age of maritime expansion, our minds often conjure images of majestic caravels slicing through azure seas, intrepid explorers charting new routes, and meticulously drawn maps expanding the known world. We think of grand conquests and the spread of influence across vast oceans. This perception, while not entirely inaccurate, often overlooks the grimy, visceral reality that underpinned such monumental achievements. The true engine of this expansion was not just the ships and their captains, but the very port cities themselves, and the lives lived within their chaotic confines. The contrasting reality found in these ports was a far cry from the clean lines of a cartographer's map. It was the stagnant water festering in puddles on cobbled streets, reflecting a dull, grey sky. It was the harsh, guttural arguments echoing from dockside taverns, often escalating into violence. It was the thick, acrid smoke of countless chimneys mingling with the stench of human waste and decaying refuse. It was the gnawing hunger in the bellies of families huddled in poor neighborhoods, their dreams as faded as their threadbare clothes. These were the sights, sounds and smells of the true origins of global expansion. These port cities, therefore, were not merely logistical points on a map. They were complex, living entities, simultaneously gateways to the world, and mirrors reflecting its deepest contradictions. They embodied the tension between unimaginable wealth and abject misery, between the desperate yearning for hygiene and the relentless march of disease, between the aspirations for order and the pervasive reality of crime. It was within this crucible of contrasts, this dynamic interplay of opposing forces, that the foundations of modernity were forged. The very chaos and struggle of these urban centers, born from the raw energy of global trade, inadvertently paved the way for future advancements, forcing societies to confront and eventually address the systemic issues that plagued them. The stories of these European ports, from the 16th to the 18th centuries, are not just tales of ships and trade, but profound insights into the human condition. They remind us that progress is rarely linear, and often comes at a significant cost, borne by those living on the margins. If you found this exploration into the unvarnished realities fascinating, we encourage you to subscribe for further journeys into the urban backstages of historical transformations. There are countless other hidden stories, untold struggles, and surprising insights waiting to be discovered in the forgotten corners of the past, particularly within the bustling, often brutal, heart of these ancient ports.